Can you hear me from here? Good? Okay. Okay. So, people who do research try different things. We try them on a small scale in a laboratory, often at a university, and then other people out in industry or in other parts of the world end up taking those ideas and doing wonderful things with them. In my own experience, early in my career, developed procedural textures to create things like this, and then other people took those ideas and started making things like this, the textures in A Perfect Storm or in Lord of the Rings. So there's this interesting path where our job is to find out how to find that first possibility that something could happen and then hand it off. So for example, I did some work in the 1990s in interactive procedural facial expression, and then that got used in a number of places, for example, as Sims, to create procedural facial animation. So my view of the world, whether it's for making products or making a world that's better for disadvantaged people or for education, is let's find ways of doing things and then hand them off to other people to take them to the next step. So the question that I ask myself always is, what will the future look like? Maybe it'll look like this. I don't know. But of course it's tricky because, as Yoda once said, always in motion is the future. And therefore it's very, very difficult to know what it's going to be. For example, in 1965, the Western Electric Company came up with this brilliant idea. They said, why don't we cross a television with a telephone? And they came up with this idea for a product. And now, it was a good idea, but it was very, very far ahead of its time, and the necessary infrastructure to do this didn't exist, and people ended up not using it, except, of course, eventually they were proven correct about 44 years later, because now we have crossed a television with a telephone. But it looks very different in today's world than it did in 1965. So our job is just come up with things. Sometimes it'll take almost half a century. Sometimes it'll take only 5 years. The goal is to keep figuring out not just how to come up with things, but how will people really use them. So my talk today is describing not so much how we create the technology, but more how will people use user interfaces in the future. What are the needs of people who are not technologists, who don't care how it works, but just want to communicate with each other. And for that, it turns out that you need to look for advice not just from technologists, but from other people as well. So Alan Kay once rather famously said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Because once you actually see it happening, then people really understand what you're talking about. Just talking about something doesn't mean very much. But for example, when Alan started creating mock-ups of the Dynabook, which eventually turned into the notebook computers and then the iPads that we have today, he started building things starting in 1968, and people could start seeing what he was talking about. So to talk about the future of user interfaces, you need to start making things. And just make something, make anything. For example, this was one concept of the future of user interfaces, although one could argue that this is not a good idea for a consumer product. But it gives you a sense of I do something and cyberspace appears in front of me. Here is another example of an experimental approach to user interfaces. This is the cave environment that was started by Tom DeFonte and colleagues at University of Illinois, where you project onto each wall and perhaps a ceiling and perhaps a floor, and somebody wears glasses and they're tracked. And from that person's perspective, it seems as though they're in another world. So then you could use this to simulate any interface. But of course, it's not practical. It costs perhaps $1 million. You're not going to have these in every home, and it takes a large amount of space. So people try different things. This is an experiment that maybe is not a good idea for a user interface. But here is something that is getting closer to an interesting idea. This is a prototype. You wear these glasses, and you can sort of see whatever you want inside the glasses. Now, there's a problem with this. The problem with this is that this architecture isolates you from the world around you. So it's not inherently a social interface. You can't see the people around you. And time and again, what we've discovered is that technologies that isolate you tend not to become adopted as much as technologies that connect you with other people. What people primarily want is to be connected with other people. Now, I had my own personal journey. Last summer, I did an arts residency at the Banff Center for the Arts up in Calgary, and they had a 3D printer there. So I started playing around with a 3D printer. How many people here have used a 3D printer? Nobody? No? How many people here want to use a 3D printer? Oh, okay. Good. That's good. Positive response. So I started printing things. I started taking some of the computer graphic programs that I had been putting out on the web as Java applets and making physical objects out of them. This was a object I had made on the computer that was a three-dimensional maze program. It builds 3D mazes, not just as a picture, but as X, Y, and Z. And here you get a sense of the size. And it was quite a revelation for me to realize that once you start making things in the real world, they have a size. Nothing really has a size in the computer screen. But there's something very emotionally powerful about seeing things that you can hold in your hand. Eventually, I enjoyed this so much that I purchased my own 3D printer. So this is the model of 3D printer I now have at home in my apartment in New York City. And I wake up in the morning and I have my coffee and I make things on my 3D printer. And it's great fun. Here's an example of one of the things I made when I was at Banff. I was very interested in taking objects that are higher dimensional, more than 3 dimensions, and bringing them down to our 3-dimensional space so that I could see them for myself. This is a hypercube. Hypercube is the equivalent of a cube in 4 dimensions. In 2 dimensions you have a square, in 3 dimensions you have a cube, in 4 dimensions you have a hypercube. So I used a technology that is hundreds of years old called the zoetrope, where you make a physical sculpture where you pose something in a different position around a circle. So this is actually a static sculpture, and I've just taken pictures of it, and I turn it and take another picture and turn it and take another picture. So it's a movie of a tumbling hypercube. So in some sense, it's 5-dimensional because it's a 3-dimensional sculpture of a 4-dimensional object moving through time. Now, in some of my other research, I had played around with interactive animated characters, procedural characters. This is one of my personal research areas. So I had a set of software to be able to direct animated characters to move, to look, to reach, to walk, and to do all these things. And I thought, why not try to bring one of these objects into the physical world? So here you can see what came out of the 3D printer. I printed a number of sculptures of my 3D character walking in a slightly different position, and each sculpture he has his foot moved in a different way, and I put them around a circle. And if you take a photograph of this and then you rotate it and take another photograph and you rotate it and take another photograph, it looks as though the character is walking. And this is the little movie I made. It's actually only a 12-frame movie. It's repeating over and over again. But again, it was very exciting to me to see my own software, something that I had created that I could only see on a computer screen, suddenly coming to life in the physical world. And that got me thinking differently about the relationship between the things that we make in the computer and the physical world around us. And I realized what I really want is to bring these things out into this world, not have them only in that world. And that got me thinking about a novel that I read in 1992 by Neil Stephenson called Snow Crash, which was written 1 year before the web really took off. And Neil Stephenson's concept of how we will all talk to each other in computer networks is that there will be physical representations of us inside of a virtual reality. And our experience of interacting with each other will be a physical embodied experience, but a virtual one. And then people have started to create things like this that are reminiscent of this, for example, Second Life. But the thing that Neil Stephenson really pointed out, and that we don't have now on the web, is that a lot of what we care about when we interact with each other is body language, facial expression, looking at other people. And we tend to lose that when we start looking at computer screens and abstracting things. So this combination of bringing my own computer graphics into the physical world and reading about this desire to have a truly human-centered way of thinking about computer networking led me to start thinking about other things. For example, Arthur C. Clarke, who was the great science fiction writer and visionary, pointed out that there are different levels of success of a technology. The successful technology is not the one where you're focused on how it works. The successful technology is the one that works in this incredibly beautiful way. And in fact, any sufficiently advanced technology, he said, is indistinguishable from magic. And this is a very profound statement. When we drive our cars, we don't think about we're accessing the automobile. We think, no, I'm going from here to there. We think about what we do. The car is successful to the point where it's magic. I am focused on how I use it, not on how it works. This wasn't always true. In the early days of the automobile, you had to be an expert mechanic to use a car. And then eventually the technology matured. Similarly, the telephone is not something that has, for most of its history, called attention to itself. You talk to your friend. The fact that you're using a telephone isn't the focus. This means it's a successful technology. Now, in my own personal opinion, Arthur C. Clarke influenced the individual who I think arguably has had the greatest impact on the new generation that's just growing up, on how they think about user interfaces. And that's this individual on the right here. This individual is the person who wrote the book that probably has changed series of books, children's view of how they should interact with the world around them. She wrote the Harry Potter books. This is J.K. Rowling. And the interesting thing about the Harry Potter books is that they say technology is magic. What do I want? Not how does it work, but what do I want? I want to have a newspaper where the people in the newspaper wave at me. I want to be able to take out a map and look at the piece of paper on the map and see the footsteps of where people are walking. I just want things that make sense to me in my social interaction with the people that I'm communicating with. Now, when J.K. Rowling first talked about these concepts in 1998, of the newspaper that waves at you, or the map that has the footsteps that shows you where people are, it was just considered fantasy. She's writing about magic for children, and people didn't take it seriously. However, today we live in a world where the newspapers can wave at you, and you can look at a map and see where people are. So the actual world that we live in today was predicted by a writer who was writing just about the ultimate user interfaces, the user interfaces that are simply magical. And I think that's a very profound statement. Don't start with how it works. Start with how do people work. The technology will catch up. One person who got this right in 1977 was George Lucas in his early Star Wars movies, the good ones. He posited technologies. He didn't think about how they would work. He just said, we live in a world where these technologies exist and we take them for granted. If Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker want to sit around and watch Princess Leia floating in thin air, they just do it. And there's some technology. But the important thing is they don't want to look at a screen. They want to sit around and have a conversation and see the virtual reality embedded in their world. And he was very consistent about this. You have the picture of the Death Star floating around the planet that it's going to threaten to blow up. And the people looking at this are just standing around watching a display that's floating in the middle of the room. They're not looking at a screen. They're not breaking their social groups. They're still standing next to each other, just the way they would in their lives, and seeing the reality existing in the lives. And similarly, when George Lucas portrays a game, like a chess-like game, he shows C-3PO and the Wookiee playing a game that somehow is projected into their own world. So the virtual goes into the physical. This right here reminds me very much of what I was trying to do. First, by creating procedurally animated characters that I could animate in real time. And next, by saying, I'm going to put these in the physical world with my 3D printer. The difference is that I have to wait for my 3D printer. This is happening instantaneously. And again, it's magic. He doesn't say how it works, but he says it's what we want. So in the last decade, a number of people have tried to do things like this. I did a project at NYU with my colleague Jeff Hahn. The two of us created something that we called Holodust, in which we would scan through the dust in the air. And as we scanned through the dust in the air with an infrared laser, the infrared laser would hit a particle of dust. And if it was a particle of dust that we thought was interesting, we would flash a visible laser. And so we would scan through the volume and create a three-dimensional sculpture in the air. And here are some of our experiments in doing that. And then you'd scan this over and you'd see the next little bit and the next little bit. One nice thing about this is that in this kind of display, you can put your hand right through the display. There's no wall stopping you. It's not inside of something. So in fact, I could be talking to a person and the display could be between us. So this was our attempt to start trying to create these virtual realities that existed in our own physical reality. Note that it's the opposite of what Neil Stephenson was saying in Snow Crash. Neil Stephenson was saying, we will all go into a virtual reality and then recreate our physical selves there. And this is the same vision that showed up, for example, in Tron in 1982, and other films, that we will recreate ourselves in a virtual reality. But no, there's this notion here that, no, bring the virtual reality to our physical world. And other people have tried to do similar things. This is some work that's at University of Southern California at the ICT group, where they have a rapidly spinning mirror and a projector that projects 15,000 frames per second. And as it's spinning, each person around the room is seeing a different view of this head. And so the person seems to be floating in space, and they can make eye contact with people. Unfortunately, you cannot put your hand through this. Otherwise, you would destroy the display, and you would definitely destroy your hand. So this is not completely immersive in the physical world. This is a shot from a TV show from last year, 2009. This was a TV show called Dollhouse that was created by Joss Whedon. And this is a scene of two mad scientists in love. And they do what mad scientists in love do. They look at floating brains floating in space between them as a means of flirting. And here, if you watch the video, there's all this sparkling stuff that's going through the air. And it's clear that what they're suggesting is a consumer version of something like our holodust display. Something in that base is lighting up particles in the air and making them glow and changing them through time. So again, it's this notion that this just exists in the world around us. Now, when we look around and we say, how are we going to know what the future of interfaces looks like? Who do we look toward? Well, we could look toward people who are building things in the laboratory, but it's also interesting to look toward what's happening in popular culture. I'm going to show you a series of videos. And these videos are all on YouTube. So they're all places everybody can see them. This is an excerpt from a recent computer game called Heavy Rain. And in this game, there's this idea that this man is interacting with a future version of a desktop interface in his office. And actually, in the fantasy of the game, the only things that really exist are the glasses and the glove. And the glove gives a high quality version of where his fingers are, and the glasses superimpose a reality onto the physical world. So he can still see the physical world around him, but he can also see something that looks like it's floating in space. And an interesting conceit is that we are seeing the video as though these are physical objects, even though, in fact, they're only objects that are created from the viewpoint of his two eyes. So there's an artistic conceit here. We're seeing a non-existent viewpoint of objects that don't exist. So we're invited into this consensual illusion. One of my favorite videos along the lines of these virtual worlds that only exist in people's minds is a very, very romantic video that's about a man who is creating a virtual world for the woman he loves. And I'm going to show you an excerpt. This man is engaged in the process of saying, I love this woman so much, I'm going to make an entire world for her to live in. And here you're going to see what amounts to a copy and paste operation. So you've all done copy and paste operations, but this is the idea of what that might be like if instead of a document, you're doing it with the entire reality. So he's just created a section of the city, and he's decided he likes it. And oh, sorry about the internet speed. I think we're all competing here for the same internet. So those of you who are reading your email instead of watching, yeah, okay. So notice, there you go. He's got the little avatar of it here, but he's placing the physical object. Sorry about this. Worked fine this morning before the room filled up. Oh, well, I may give up on this one. Too bad. Okay. You can Google for it, that's right. World Builder. High quality. Okay. Right, and so here's an interesting example of a man who is actually standing in the middle of downtown Tokyo. And unlike the previous videos, this one is not a trick. This one is really happening. He's holding a card, and the card is white, but I'll tell you before you even see the video that in the four corners of the card, behind it, there are 4 little infrared LEDs shining from behind it. And facing him, in front of him, is an infrared camera that is tracking the position of those 4 LEDs. And there's a projector that's projecting imagery onto this thing.
Maybe everyone who just Googled World Builder and is watching it on YouTube should stop.
Yeah. Yeah, the internet connection here is actually fine, except for all the people competing with it. So this morning it was actually going very well. Well, maybe I'll just show brief excerpts of these videos. What you're going to see, and if I have to abandon it, I'll abandon it, is he also has an infrared marker, an infrared light on the little marker he's holding. So the camera can also see where his pen tip is. And as he's drawing things, the computer is actually recreating everything he's drawing, and you're seeing the thing going out to the system, back from the camera, and back in through the projector onto the card. And once he draws it, he's created a coordinate system for the objects, and so as he moves the card, the objects move with the card. Wow, this is really bad. This is definitely not as good as it was before. That's too bad.
You could also try turning down the resolution from 480 to 270.
All right. Let's see, which one is that? This one right here. Let's go down to here and see what happens. No, it's really unhappy. We go that way. That way. Oops, that was my next slide. Go down to here. No, I think we've hit saturation on the internet. Okay. So that's okay. Hopefully, if people can gradually stop using the internet, then the next time I show a video, we'll see it. But this one, I think for now, we're at a lost cause. See, maybe I can show you shots from it. No. Okay. Oops. Okay. So there's nothing surprising about that video, except for the fact that in order for it to work, you need a camera, you need a projector, you need a special card. It's fun, but it's not part of our daily lives. It's part of a special magic show setup. So how could we make something like this part of our everyday world? Let me just try one more time to see if that works. Maybe if people have stopped using the internet for a bit. I'm being an optimist. But now it's really not working. Now somehow my browser got confused. Oh well. So maybe we can start putting information directly into our brains. Maybe we can start wiring things into our heads. Okay. Something's wrong. My computer is now freaked out. Hold on. Let's reload this so we don't have any problems. See if this works. Oh well. We'll see how it goes. So those of you who saw The Matrix, how many people saw The Matrix? Some people didn't see The Matrix. Wow. How many people saw Tron? How many people saw Star Wars? How many people saw Avatar? Not everyone. There are people who didn't see Avatar. How many people have not seen a movie? Okay, all right. Just curious. Now let's go back. So those of you who saw The Matrix know that The Matrix pretty much agrees with Neil Stephenson in this idea that we go into a world that is completely recreated for us in all of its details, but none of it's real. It's directly tapped into our brains. And in fact, the physical body is not used at all. Only the brain's idea of a body is used. And so this is one possibility. And people have done research in electrical stimulation, in putting things into different parts of the brain, figuring out how to map. If I stimulate this, then I have this perception and this muscle activity. And this mapping has gone pretty far. In fact, people have built these chips that go inside the skull and connect with actual brain tissue, but it's a very difficult proposition. For one thing, your brain tissue rejects these implants after several weeks. It realizes on some biological level that this is foreign invasion, so it's not, at least by current technology, it's not a viable long-term solution. And also there are many things we don't understand about how the brain works. So this is, in some sense, not necessarily the best way of doing this. There are these other approaches. One could perhaps build a magic contact lens that you put inside of your eye. And when you put it inside of your eye, you end up, the contact lens somehow creates a display in the world around you. In fact, there's a Professor Parviz at University of Washington who is taking the first steps toward doing something just like this, making components, electronic components, that go into a contact lens and gradually asking all of the very difficult questions. One of the things that's a problem about this is that the contact lens is in the wrong place in the optical system. The contact lens is not out here where our lens can image it. The contact lens is over here. And over here, the problem is that you can't use our own internal optical system of our lens if you're creating an image that's over here. So you'd have to use completely new imaging techniques, some of which don't quite exist yet, and you'd have to power it, and you'd have to get electricity to it, and then you'd have to make it so that the eye doesn't reject it. So it's a very difficult thing. I think this will eventually happen, but I think it's not going to happen in less than 15 years. It might happen by the quarter of a century mark, perhaps. But there are many enabling technologies that don't exist yet for this. So what can we do meanwhile to create the display that just floats in front of us? Well, there's a whole set of technologies that are collectively called retinal displays. They're called retinal displays because rather than having an explicit screen out here, instead, an optical system uses the optical system in your eye, much the way that the objective of a microscope or a telescope uses the optical system of your eye. It allows your eye to start doing a lot of the work of finishing the optical system. And this allows you to create small personal displays. This looks very clunky. This is not clearly not a consumer item at this point. It's by Microvision, but it does have one very interesting innovation. And the innovation is this thing right here. That element that you're looking at allows this man to look straight out through a clear window, and at the same time, through that same clear window, an image is coming in. The way it's happening is that the module up here is sending different parts of an image down to different parts of this. They're hitting little micro prisms embedded in this and then being sent into his pupil from different directions. And because the microprisms are sparsely placed, most of what he sees comes from the outside world, and because the microprisms are very close, he doesn't actually explicitly see them, he just sees the various rays of light. So this is an enabling technology that one could see building toward eventually having an unobtrusive display. The Micro-Optical Corporation has tried things like, let's put a little 45-degree prism that's very small. It does interfere somewhat with the left eye, but the right eye is looking out unimpeded, and the idea is to make these things smaller and smaller. And in fact, something that was shown this is a Brother Electronics, showed this in an electronics show in Tokyo within the last year, and you can see that this is a dual-purpose reflector, so that she is actually able to look straight out past the eye, even with the left eye, while at the same time this little module is sending an image into her head. Now, this isn't the answer to the question of the magic thing floating in front of you. This is one component of it, because just having this isn't good enough. If I wanted to have a virtual version of this glass floating in front of me, it's not good enough for me to just be able to have a display. I also need to have something that tracks the position and orientation of my head faster than the screen refresh, so that as I move my head around, a computer can be recreating in real time where the object is supposed to go. And in fact, it has to be error-free, otherwise the object will appear to swim physically in the physical world, and it won't be believable. Steve Feiner at Columbia University has been working on augmented reality for a number of years, but one of the things about most academic research, including his, is that it's seen as a sort of a specialty item. You need very large hardware. You need, it's not integrated into your everyday life. A pioneer, in a way, has been Steve Mann. Steve Mann has made it his mission to say he is going to wear augmented reality glasses all the time. And at first, when he started his research 20 years ago, he had these giant backpacks, and he had these big goggles, and he'd have to walk around looking like the Borg from Star Trek. Now it would be a problem because he wouldn't even be able to get through airport security with things like that. But since then, he's gotten it progressively smaller and smaller and smaller, and now he just has a pair of glasses that just has, if you notice, this single line through it, and this line has here and here these two little display devices. And he also has little unobtrusive cameras, so he can look out and figure out where he's looking, and the computer can figure out where he's looking. It's still problematic, because if you look at Steve Mann, you look straight at him, you can't quite see his eyes, because they're blocked by these displays. So there's something about this particular display device that actually really isn't all that socially friendly. Now, Thad Starner at Georgia Tech has compromised. He's he has these glasses, and you can see he has this this little square right here that it's basically a prism, and if you look very carefully, you can see a module over here that's hitting the prism and shining light into his eyes. So you can look directly into his right eye, but not quite with his left eye. And he is trying to work out the whole system of I gesture and I say something, and the computer understands from things that I say and do that are part of my social life what my intent is in getting the computer to give me information without removing me from the world. Those of you who have smartphones, whether you have iPhones or you have Android or you have one of these other smartphones, everybody knows that as soon as you take out one of these smartphones and you look at it, you're disrupting the social contract. You're no longer in a conversation with another person. So the goal eventually would be to not disrupt the social contract. By the way, I visited Georgia Tech recently, and Thad wasn't there. And I spoke with his colleagues, the other faculty members in his department. And they told me, Thad doesn't know it, but when he thinks that I think he's talking to me, but he's actually reading his email, I know he's reading his email. So there is a problem. He has a slightly distracted look, and he's pretending to be talking to them. So there are some other issues to be worked out here. Now, Blair McIntyre, also at Georgia Tech, he's doing something different. He's not trying to use futuristic devices. He's trying to use smartphones. But he's trying to integrate a network of smartphones into the social world around us to create an affordable infrastructure for people superimposing a virtual world on our real world. And that leads me to what I think is the crucial reason that now, 2011, is the right time to be looking at these things. 2006 wasn't the right time, 2001 wasn't the right time, 2008 wasn't the right time, but now is the right time. Because every technology has its moment when everything comes together. In 2001, Microsoft attempted to get the world to use tablets, and they came up with a perfectly fine device. There's nothing wrong with the tablet PC. It's actually a very functional and very powerful device. But the problem is, it did not solve a problem that people understood to be part of their lives. It was just a brilliant piece of technology. It wasn't the answer to people's questions. Then, of course, 8 years later, Apple Computer came out with a device which in many ways is similar, and millions of people desperately wanted it. What had happened in those intermediate 8 years was that Apple Computer created a need. They created a need by building the iPhone, by having people learn to use multi-touch gestures, by creating the App Store and iTunes, and building an infrastructure of desire. And I think now we have a cultural game-changing moment for augmented reality, and that is that augmented reality, having arrived on smartphones, means that people now know why they want it. In fact, they ask the one question that everybody across their political orientation or cultural orientation all wants, which is, where can I find pizza? You can take your smartphone now and you can hold it up to the world and find out where is the thing that you want. And now suddenly you're seeing articles in newspapers and magazines for non-technical people using the phrase augmented reality. People get it now. So what will these things look like? Well, there was a time when this was the only way you could have a hands-free headset. There was a kind of geek chic of having these things. They were big, they were clunky, but I'm wearing my tech. But now we're starting to get to the point where people are putting these tiny little things here, and they're becoming part of fashion. Now, I'd like to point out they're not becoming invisible. Invisible is the technology that you don't like that people know you have. When you have a hearing aid, you want it to be invisible because you feel, I don't want people to know that there's a problem. But being able to talk to someone who's not there without using your hands is not a problem to hide. It's a superpower to show off. So it's starting to become fashion. This is the jawbone. It's becoming a fashion object. And I think we need to create fashion objects for this to work. So, for example, maybe we create something that looks like this. And this is actually perfectly doable with today's technology. Unlike the contact lens solution, you could actually use this as basically a slightly more refined version of those prisms that send light from a display that's clipped to your ear. But you could do even better with today's technology, because in fact, you could put a contact lens that has nothing in it at all, no electricity, except that on a nanoscopic level, it contains little ridges that respond to the right light. This is a standard industrial product. This is a nanoscale mirror. If you send a laser light or any collimated light of the right frequency in a right direction, it will either reflect it or it will refract it in a known direction. So in fact, you could take a contact lens and you could, at a nanoscopic scale, embed the right stuff into it, and it wouldn't interfere with your ability to see right through it because it's smaller than the wavelength of visible light. However, then you could have a form factor that looks like this, more or less, or around the ear is clipped to that. In fact, it could even look like this. The only important thing is that the little thing that's sending the light to the contact lens has a clear line of sight, and then what you would see when you look out is whatever virtual reality you want to see in front of you. And then you could do things like start walking around and automatically identifying who people are, for example. You try to do this with a smartphone, it's not so great. If you hold up your smartphone to someone's face, they know you don't know who they are. But if you are just looking at them and your little display, like in RoboCop, shows it, then it's fine. This is an interesting little video made by a, oops, so the videos aren't working now. Maybe they are. Okay, we'll see if this one runs. I'll just show you a minute of this. So this is a student who created a fantasy of the interface he would like. So notice what happened there. All he's using is his hands, and the fantasy is that a technology exists that's tracking his fingers, like a futuristic version of Microsoft Kinect, and that we see what he's seeing superimposed on him, so he's having a conversation with him, and all the with us, and all the cyberspace is merely an augmentation of the social conversation we're already happening. So this is a much more interesting view. I'm going to show a very quick video of, just to be fair, an example of somebody showing a video where it really all goes wrong. So this is the technology in a world where we have augmented reality everywhere. This is a man in an augmented reality world making a cup of tea. If you notice carefully, there's actually a sign there of all the little things that says Real World Meetup this weekend, like people who are somehow still stuck in the real world. Then, of course, he goes out of this virtual reality, this calm one, and goes into the uncontrolled one. All right. So things aren't always. So I would argue that it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing that we can do this. It's up to us what we want to do with this. We could live in a world where books are replaced by empty bookshelves, but we end up seeing virtual versions of the books. In fact, many of these issues are actually discussed in Werner Vinge's Rainbow's End, which is a recent novel that says, suppose we had Professor Parvis's contact lenses, and we could track everything and superimpose them. And he discusses how this could be both good or bad things. There are technical challenges that I hope some people in this room would be interested in. For example, being able to track people with no latency. This is, at its longest dimension, 1 centimeter long. And this object here is able to do 3 dimensions of orientation and 3 dimensions of position through accelerometers and electronic gyroscopes in a package that's about this big, the longest dimension, the difference between the space between my 2 fingers. And it can do this plenty fast enough to track your head, and it could fit into something about the size of that little jawbone display. And to avoid longer-term drift, you could have tiny little cameras that actually are doing, in the background, long-term absolute tracking. So between these 2 things, we could have a very low-latency, high-speed update of exactly where position orientation is, superimpose that with the display. So we could do this, and I'm actually working on things like this now. In our lab, our students are working, I have colleagues that I'm working with at MIT, and we're doing different parts of this together. But to me, the interesting questions are then, once you have the technology where every one of us can see Princess Leia in a beam of light, while we're talking to each other, where when I want a virtual object, I just go ahead and I use a SketchUp-like interface and say it's there, and I go to sleep the next morning and I wake up and my 3D printer has printed it. Socially, it was there the moment I created it. When we live in that world where we won't need physical signs because virtual signs will be superimposed in the language we want, customized for us in the physical world around us, and when these screens get gradually replaced by a social reality that's enhanced, what do we want to do with it? This is the hard question. What are the social questions, the economic questions, the questions for the digital divide? How do we help education with these things? And so what kinds of new genres and art forms? Will there be things that are beyond movies and books and games? Something else entirely that we can start working on, some new art forms or ways of participating with each other. And what kind of future will we make? That's the interesting question, and that's the question I'd like to leave you with. Thank you.